never imagined that my life would unravel so completely that I'd find myself working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Millbrook Heights. But sometimes fate has its own cruel sense of timing. 6 months earlier, I had been Seraphina Cavendish Thornfield, wife of prominent investment banker Maximilian Thornfield, living in a sprawling colonial mansion with manicured gardens and a 3-car garage. Now, I was simply Seraphina, pumping gas and restocking energy drinks for truckers and insomniacs, trying to scrape together enough money to keep my one-bedroom apartment and maybe afford groceries that weren't from the clearance section. The divorce had been swift and merciless. Maximilian's lawyers had outmaneuvered mine at every turn, somehow managing to paint me as an unstable, vindictive wife who had contributed nothing to our 12-year marriage, despite the fact that I had given up my career in environmental law to support his ambitions and manage our household. They had documentation of my supposed erratic behavior, witness statements from friends I thought I could trust, and a psychological evaluation that made me sound like I was one step away from a complete breakdown. The settlement left me with almost nothing, just enough to avoid complete destitution, but not nearly enough to maintain any semblance of the life I had known. What hurt most wasn't the financial devastation, though that was crushing enough. It was the systematic way Maximilian had isolated me from everyone who might have supported me through the process. My sister Cordelia had sided with him, convinced by his careful manipulation that I had become impossible to live with. My parents, already distant since their retirement to Arizona, had accepted his version of events without question, telling me over a stilted phone call that perhaps this was for the best, and I could use this time to get my life together. Even my closest friends had gradually pulled away, fed a steady diet of carefully crafted stories about my increasingly unstable behavior and unreasonable demands. The gas station job had been a last resort, the only place that would hire someone with a 12-year gap in their employment history and no recent references that weren't connected to my ex-husband's circle of influence. The manager, a weathered man named Roberto Quinones, had looked at my application with obvious skepticism, but had been desperate enough for overnight coverage to give me a chance. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it came with health insurance after 90 days and the kind of anonymity I desperately needed while I tried to figure out how to rebuild my life from scratch. Working the night shift meant dealing with a steady parade of characters that most people never see. Long-haul truckers grabbing coffee and cigarettes, shift workers heading home from factories, teenagers buying energy drinks and snacks with crumpled bills, and the occasional person who seemed to have nowhere else to go in the middle of the night. I learned to read people quickly, to spot trouble before it started, and to maintain the right balance of friendliness and professional distance that kept me safe behind the bulletproof glass that separated the cashier area from the rest of the store. Most nights blended together in a haze of fluorescent lighting and the constant hum of refrigeration units, but Tuesday, March 15th, was different from the moment my shift began. The weather had been unseasonably warm for early spring, and there was an electric quality to the air that made everyone seem slightly on edge. I had been working for 3 months by then, long enough to recognize the regular customers and predict the rhythm of the night, but something felt off from the moment I clocked in at 11 o'clock. Around 2:30 in the morning, during the dead quiet that always settled over the station between the late-night bar crowd and the early morning commuters, I heard the distinctive rumble of an expensive engine pulling up to pump number 4. Through the security cameras, I could see a sleek black Lamborghini, its paint job so pristine it seemed to absorb the harsh parking lot lighting and transform it into something elegant. The car was completely out of place in our modest gas station, which typically saw pickup trucks, economy cars, and the occasional luxury sedan from someone who had taken a wrong turn off the highway. The driver who emerged from the car was not what I expected. Instead of some young tech entrepreneur or a flashy businessman, I saw an elderly man who moved with careful deliberation, as if each step required conscious thought and effort. He was impeccably dressed despite the late hour, wearing a navy wool coat over what appeared to be a cashmere sweater, with silver hair that caught the light as he walked toward the station entrance. Everything about him suggested wealth and refinement, from the way he carried himself to the subtle gleam of what looked like an expensive watch on his wrist. He approached the counter with the kind of measured politeness that spoke of old-fashioned manners, placing his hands carefully on the surface as he spoke. His voice was cultured, with the faint traces of an accent I couldn't immediately place, British perhaps, or educated somewhere in the Eastern establishment schools that produced a particular type of aristocratic pronunciation. "Good evening, miss. I apologize for the late hour, but I wonder if I might trouble you for a bottle of water? I'm afraid I've forgotten to bring any with me, and I have quite a drive ahead." There was something about his demeanor that was both formal and kind, as if he was genuinely concerned about inconveniencing me, despite the fact that serving customers was literally my job. Most people who stopped by during the night shift treated me like part of the equipment, someone to process their transaction as quickly as possible so they could get back to whatever urgent business had brought them out at 3 in the morning. This man spoke to me as if I were a person worthy of courtesy and consideration. "Of course," I replied, gesturing toward the refrigerated section. "We have several brands. Is there a particular type you prefer?" He smiled, and I noticed that his eyes were a striking pale blue, the kind that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Whatever you would recommend, my dear. I trust your judgment." It was such an unusual response that I found myself actually considering the question instead of just pointing him toward the most popular brand. I walked him over to the cooler and selected a bottle of premium spring water, not the cheapest option, but something that seemed appropriate for someone who drove a car worth more than most people's annual salary. "This one is quite good," I said, handing him the bottle. "It's from a natural spring in the Adirondacks, very pure with a clean taste." He examined the label with the kind of attention most people reserved for wine selections, nodding appreciatively. "An excellent choice. Thank you for taking such care with the recommendation." As we walked back to the counter, he glanced around the station with what seemed like genuine interest, rather than the disdain or indifference I usually saw from wealthy customers who found themselves in our humble establishment. "Do you enjoy working here?" he asked, and the question caught me so off guard that I almost laughed. "It's honest work," I replied carefully, unsure how much of my story I wanted to share with a stranger, no matter how polite he seemed. "Indeed, it is," he said, nodding as if my answer held some deeper meaning. "There's dignity in honest work, regardless of what others might think. I've found that you learn more about a person's character from how they treat service workers than from almost any other interaction. Something in his tone suggested he was speaking from experience, as if he had been in positions to observe such interactions and draw conclusions from them. I rang up his purchase, noting that he paid with cash from what appeared to be a substantial roll of bills, leaving a generous tip that was more than I typically made in an entire shift. "Thank you very much," he said, picking up the water bottle. "I hope the rest of your evening is peaceful." I expected him to leave then, to return to his expensive car and disappear back into whatever world he had emerged from. But instead, he paused at the door, turning back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "If you don't mind my asking, what did you do before this job?" The question was direct, but asked with such genuine interest that I found myself answering honestly. I was a lawyer, environmental law, mostly working with conservation groups and sustainable development projects. His eyebrows rose slightly, not in surprise, but in what looked like recognition. "And what brought you here?" It was the kind of question that could have been intrusive, but something about his manner made it feel like a conversation between equals rather than idle curiosity from someone slumming in my workplace. "Life changes," I said simply. "Sometimes you have to start over." He nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Yes, life has a way of taking unexpected turns, but I've found that how we handle those turns often reveals more about our true character than the circumstances that preceded them." There was something almost prophetic about the way he spoke, as if he was sharing wisdom earned through significant experience with unexpected turns of his own. He stood there for another moment, studying my face with an intensity that was neither uncomfortable nor inappropriate, just deeply thoughtful. "Well, Miss Cavendish," I supplied, using my maiden name, which I had legally returned to after the divorce. "Miss Cavendish, it has been a pleasure meeting you. I suspect we shall see each other again." With that cryptic comment, he walked out to his car, and I watched through the security cameras as he carefully placed the water bottle in the passenger seat and started the engine. The Lamborghini's exhaust note was magnificent, even through the distorted audio of the security system, a deep, powerful sound that spoke of precision engineering and unlimited resources. But as he pulled away from the pump, something unexpected happened. Instead of driving directly to the exit, he pulled up parallel to the station entrance and lowered his window. I couldn't see clearly what he was doing, but it appeared he was gesturing for me to come outside. I hesitated, aware of all the safety protocols that warned against leaving the secured area during overnight shifts, but something about this man's presence had been so fundamentally non-threatening that I found myself walking to the door. As I stepped outside, he leaned out of the car window and handed me something. "This is for you," he said simply. "Use it wisely." Before I could ask what he meant or even look at what he had given me, he shifted the car into gear and drove away, the Lamborghini's taillights disappearing into the darkness with surprising speed. I stood in the parking lot, holding whatever he had pressed into my hand, feeling the cool night air and listening to the distant sound of his engine fading into the ambient noise of the highway. When I looked down, I nearly dropped what I was holding. It was cash, more cash than I had seen in one place since before my divorce, bound with a simple rubber band and folded in half. My hands were shaking as I counted it under the harsh parking lot lights, unable to believe what I was seeing. $10,000, all in $100 bills, crisp and new as if they had just come from the bank. I looked around the empty parking lot, half expecting to see the Lamborghini returning, the elderly man having realized he had made some kind of mistake. But the road remained empty, and I was left standing alone with more money than I had seen in months, given to me by a complete stranger who had asked for nothing more than a bottle of water and a few minutes of polite conversation. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of disbelief and anxiety. I kept the money hidden in my jacket pocket, afraid to leave it in the register, or anywhere else someone might see it, but equally afraid to believe it was real. Every time a customer entered the store, I half expected it to be the elderly man, returning to explain that there had been some mistake, that the money was meant for someone else, or that he had confused me with another person entirely. But he never returned, and by the time my replacement arrived at 7 in the morning, I had convinced myself that the entire encounter had been some kind of elaborate dream brought on by too many energy drinks and not enough sleep. It wasn't until I was in my car, driving home through the early morning traffic, that I allowed myself to take the money out and count it again, confirming that it was real and that my life had somehow been changed by a chance encounter with a stranger. My apartment had never felt more modest than it did that morning as I sat at my tiny kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills and trying to make sense of what had happened. $10,000 was enough to pay off my credit card debt, catch up on my rent, maybe even take some time to look for a better job instead of being trapped in survival mode at the gas station. But accepting such a gift from a stranger felt wrong somehow, like there must be some catch or expectation that I wasn't seeing. I spent the day researching expensive cars and their owners, wondering if there was some way to identify the man and return his money, but I realized quickly that the task was impossible. Lamborghini ownership wasn't exactly public information, and I didn't even know his name or have any way to contact him. All I had was the memory of his kindness, his cultured voice, and his enigmatic parting words about using the money wisely. That evening, I called in sick to work for the first time since I had started the job, unable to face the prospect of returning to the gas station while I was still processing what had happened. I needed time to think, to decide what to do with this unexpected windfall, and to figure out whether accepting it was the right thing to do. The money sat on my kitchen table like a judgment, challenging me to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this moment of unexpected opportunity. Wednesday passed slowly, filled with internal debates and second-guessing. I found myself picking up the phone multiple times to call Roberto and explain that I needed to return to work, that I couldn't afford to take time off. But each time I stopped myself. The money on my table represented freedom, even if only temporary, and I realized I hadn't felt free in months, maybe years. Thursday morning brought a phone call that changed everything again. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit, but something made me answer. "Miss Cavendish, my name is Theodore Ashworth. I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Percival Montclair Wessington. I believe you may have met him recently." The formal tone and unfamiliar names meant nothing to me at first, but something about the caller's voice suggested serious business, the kind of call that required attention rather than the quick dismissal I usually gave to unknown numbers. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I know anyone by that name, I replied, though even as I said it, something about the cadence of the caller's speech reminded me of the elderly man from the gas station. Mr. Montclair Wessington passed away yesterday morning, Theodore Ashworth continued, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered such news regularly. He was 83 years old. His final wishes included specific instructions regarding you, Miss Cavendish. I wonder if we might arrange a meeting to discuss the details. The connection between the mysterious wealthy man and someone who had supposedly left me instructions began to form in my mind, but it seemed too unlikely to be real. People didn't leave instructions for gas station cashiers they had met once for 5 minutes, especially wealthy people with formal estates and lawyers who spoke in measured, professional tones. I think there might be some mistake, I said carefully. I don't know anyone named Percival, and I can't imagine why someone would include me in their final wishes. Nevertheless, Miss Cavendish, the instructions are quite specific. Mr. Montclair Wessington was very particular about detail, and he left explicit directions regarding your inheritance. Might we arrange a meeting at your convenience? This is a matter that requires in-person discussion. The word inheritance hit me like a physical blow. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, staring at the money that was still spread across its surface, beginning to understand that whatever had happened Tuesday night was far more significant than a random act of kindness from a wealthy stranger. My inheritance? I repeated, needing to hear the words again to believe them. Indeed. Mr. Montclair Wessington has left you the entirety of his estate, Miss Cavendish. It's quite substantial, I'm afraid, and there are numerous legal documents that require your attention. When would be convenient for you to meet? My hands were shaking again, as they had when I first counted the money, but this time it wasn't from disbelief, so much as from the growing realization that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The modest apartment around me suddenly felt like a stage set for a play that was ending, about to be struck and replaced with something entirely different. I need to think about this, I managed to say. This is all very unexpected. Of course, Miss Cavendish, this must come as quite a shock. However, I should mention that Mr. Montclair Wessington was quite insistent that we move quickly with the estate settlement. He was concerned about timing for reasons he didn't fully explain, but he stressed the importance of completing the transfer as soon as possible after his passing. Something about the urgency troubled me, suggesting complications I didn't understand. Transfer of what exactly? Everything, Miss Cavendish. His home, his investments, his business interests, his personal effects. The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, though the final accounting may adjust that figure somewhat. The number was so large I couldn't process it. $47 million was more money than I could conceptualize, the kind of wealth that existed in news articles about tech billionaires and oil heiresses, not in the life of a divorced environmental lawyer working the night shift at a gas station. I must have been quiet for too long, because Theodore Ashworth's voice returned with a note of concern. Miss Cavendish, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. This is overwhelming. Why would someone I met once leave me their entire estate? It doesn't make sense. Mr. Montclair Wessington left detailed letters explaining his decision, Miss Cavendish. Those documents will be shared with you when we meet, along with all the legal paperwork required for the transfer. Shall we say tomorrow at 2 o'clock? My office is downtown, but I'm happy to meet wherever would be most convenient for you. I agreed to meet at his office, partly because I needed time to process what was happening, and partly because meeting in a professional setting felt safer than inviting a stranger to my apartment. After hanging up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen, surrounded by the $10,000 in cash and the growing understanding that my entire world was about to shift in ways I had never imagined possible. The rest of Thursday passed in a strange, suspended state between my old life and whatever was coming next. I tried to go about my normal routine, paying bills, doing laundry, preparing for what I assumed would be my return to the gas station, but everything felt surreal and temporary. The money on my table had become a symbol of change, a bridge between who I had been and who I was about to become. But I still couldn't understand why. Friday afternoon, I dressed in the one professional outfit I still owned, a navy suit that had survived the divorce because it had been hanging in the back of my closet and somehow escaped Maximilian's lawyer's inventory of our shared assets. The building that housed Theodore Ashworth's law firm was the kind of place I had once visited regularly in my former life, all polished marble and understated elegance that spoke of serious money and serious business. Theodore Ashworth himself was exactly what I had expected from his voice on the phone. A man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of careful grooming that suggested attention to detail in all aspects of his professional life. His office was lined with law books and filled with the kind of furniture that was clearly expensive but chose understatement over ostentation. Miss Cavendish, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. Can I offer you coffee, tea, anything to make you more comfortable? I declined refreshments, too nervous to trust my stomach with anything, and waited while he arranged several thick folders on his desk between us. First, let me express my condolences on Mr. Montclair Wessington's passing. I had been his attorney for nearly 20 years, and I can tell you he was a remarkable man with very definite ideas about how his affairs should be handled. I still don't understand why he chose me, I said, needing to voice the confusion that had been growing since his phone call. We spoke for maybe 10 minutes. He bought a bottle of water. That was the extent of our interaction. Theodore Ashworth opened one of the folders and removed what appeared to be a handwritten letter on expensive stationery. Mr. Montclair Wessington anticipated your confusion, Miss Cavendish. He left this letter specifically to explain his decision. With your permission, I'll read the relevant portions. I nodded, unable to speak, as he adjusted his reading glasses and began to read in a voice that carried the formality of legal proceedings, but also a personal warmth that suggested genuine respect for his late client. My dear Miss Cavendish, if you are hearing this letter, it means I have passed away and my affairs are being settled as I requested. I know you must be confused by my decision to leave you my estate, given the brief nature of our acquaintance, but I hope this explanation will help you understand both my reasoning and the responsibilities I am asking you to accept. He paused, looking up at me over his glasses. Would you prefer to read this yourself, or shall I continue? Please continue, I whispered, afraid that if I tried to read the letter myself, I might miss something important in my emotional state. I have spent my entire adult life building wealth and accumulating assets, But I have also spent that time observing people and trying to understand what truly matters in human character. My business brought me into contact with thousands of individuals over the decades, from the very wealthy to those struggling to make ends meet, and I learned to recognize qualities that money cannot buy and cannot corrupt. The letter continued with observations about integrity, kindness, and the way people treat others when they believe no one of importance is watching. As Theodore Ashworth read, I began to understand that my brief interaction with Percival Montclair Wessington had been some kind of test, though I still couldn't grasp why I had passed it or what he had seen in our short conversation that convinced him to entrust me with his life's work. But most importantly, Miss Cavendish, I recognized in you something I had lost many years ago: the ability to show genuine kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return. When I asked what you did before your current work, and you told me about your background in environmental law, I saw not shame about your current circumstances, but dignity in honest work and determination to rebuild your life on your own terms. The letter explained that Percival had built his fortune through careful investments and business ventures, but that he had never married and had no children or close family members to inherit his wealth. Rather than leave everything to distant relatives who had never shown him any kindness, or to charitable organizations that might not use the money as he intended, he had spent several years developing a plan to find someone worthy of his trust. I realize this inheritance comes with tremendous responsibility, Miss Cavendish, and I do not expect you to simply enjoy the money without understanding why I am entrusting it to you. There are conditions attached to this bequest, not legal restrictions, but moral obligations that I hope you will choose to honor. My heart sank slightly at the mention of conditions, wondering what strings were attached to this incredible gift. But Theodore Ashworth's expression remained reassuring as he continued reading. First, I ask that you use a portion of this inheritance to complete your own recovery from whatever circumstances led you to our chance meeting. You deserve security and the opportunity to rebuild your professional life without the fear of financial ruin. Second, I hope you will consider using your legal background and the resources I am providing to continue the environmental work that clearly meant something to you. The world needs people who understand both law and conservation, and you have the opportunity to make a real difference. The letter went on to explain that Percival had been a private philanthropist for years, quietly funding environmental projects and conservation efforts around the world, but that he had grown frustrated with large organizations that seemed to spend more money on administration than on actual conservation work. He wanted someone who understood both the legal complexities of environmental protection and the practical challenges of implementing meaningful change. Finally, Miss Cavendish, I ask that you remember what brought us together: the simple act of treating a stranger with kindness and respect. Money has a way of changing people, and I hope you will use this inheritance not just to improve your own circumstances, but to help others who find themselves in situations similar to the one you are in now. When Theodore Ashworth finished reading, he folded the letter carefully and handed it to me, along with a thick stack of legal documents that would apparently transfer $47 million and associated assets into my name. There are also more detailed instructions regarding specific investments and ongoing charitable commitments that Mr. Montclair Wessington hoped you would continue, but those can be discussed over time. For now, the immediate question is whether you are prepared to accept this inheritance and the responsibilities that come with it. I held the letter in my hands, reading portions of it again, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered and what was being asked of me in return. The money would solve every financial problem I had, would give me security I had never imagined possible, but it would also change everything about my life in ways I couldn't predict. What happens if I say no? I asked, though even as I voiced the question, I realized how absurd it sounded. The estate would revert to a complex network of charitable organizations that Mr. Montclair Wessington specified as secondary beneficiaries. The money would do good work, but it would be distributed through established channels rather than being used by someone who understood his personal philosophy about making a difference. I thought about my apartment, my job at the gas station, the constant anxiety about paying bills and whether I would ever be able to rebuild my career. Then I thought about the environmental cases I had worked on before my marriage, the satisfaction of using legal tools to protect natural resources and promote sustainable development. The inheritance wouldn't just solve my financial problems, it would give me the opportunity to return to work that had meaning, but on a scale I had never imagined possible. "There's one more thing," Theodore Ashworth said, opening another folder. Mr. Montclair Wessington was quite specific about timing. He had been monitoring his health carefully and knew his time was limited. He chose to approach you when he did because he wanted to observe your character in your current circumstances, but he also wanted to ensure that the estate transfer happened quickly after his passing. "Why the rush?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect there were complications he hadn't yet explained. Mr. Montclair Wessington had reason to believe that certain family members, distant relatives who had been estranged from him for years, might attempt to contest the will, despite having no legal standing to do so. The faster we complete the transfer, the less opportunity they have to create delays or complications. The mention of potential legal challenges reminded me uncomfortably of my own experience with divorce lawyers and contested proceedings, but it also reinforced my sense that Percival Montclair Wessington had been a man who understood both human nature and legal strategy. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. "Ideally, we should begin the process immediately if you're prepared to accept. The preliminary paperwork can be completed today, and the major asset transfers can happen within a week if there are no complications." I looked down at the letter again, reading his description of what he had seen in me during our brief conversation, trying to understand how a chance encounter over a bottle of water had led to this moment. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the opportunity to honor the trust of someone who had seen potential in me when I could barely see it in myself. "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "I accept." Theodore Ashworth spent the next several hours walking me through the preliminary paperwork, explaining investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and ongoing business interests that I was about to inherit. The sheer complexity of Percival's financial empire was staggering, involving properties in 6 states, investment accounts with multiple firms, and a series of carefully managed charitable trusts that had been funding environmental projects for decades. Mr. Montclair Wessington was very methodical about his wealth management, Theodore explained as we reviewed document after document. He believed in diversification and long-term thinking. You'll have access to financial advisors who have been managing these accounts for years, so you won't be expected to navigate all of this alone. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand that accepting this inheritance meant accepting not just money, but an entire infrastructure of responsibility. There were employees to consider, ongoing commitments to honor, and investment decisions that would affect not just my future, but the futures of people I had never met, who depended on the charitable work Percival had supported. "There's one final matter we need to discuss today," Theodore said as we neared the end of the paperwork session. "Mr. Montclair Wessington left specific instructions about revealing certain information to you only after you had formally accepted the inheritance." Something in his tone made me look up from the documents I had been signing, alert to a shift in the conversation that suggested we were approaching something significant. "What kind of information?" "Details about why he chose you specifically, Miss Cavendish. The letter I read earlier explained his general philosophy about character and kindness, but there were more personal reasons for his decision that he wanted kept confidential unless you agreed to accept the inheritance." My stomach tightened with apprehension. After everything that had happened in the past few days, I had learned to be wary of revelations that people saved for strategic moments. The inheritance had seemed too good to be true from the beginning, and I wondered what complications were about to emerge. "Is there something I should be concerned about?" I asked carefully. "Not concerned exactly, but there are aspects of Mr. Montclair Wessington's connection to you that go beyond your chance meeting at the gas station. He had been aware of your existence for some time before he decided to approach you." The word sent a chill through me. The idea that this wealthy stranger had been watching me, following my movements, tracking my circumstances, was both frightening and deeply unsettling. I thought about all the random customers who had come through the gas station during my months of working there, wondering how many had been observing me on someone else's behalf. "What do you mean, aware of my existence?" Theodore Ashworth opened the final folder on his desk, removing what appeared to be a thick file with my name written on the tab. Inside were photographs, documents, and what looked like investigative reports spanning several months. "Mr. Montclair Wessington hired a private investigation firm to research your background after your divorce became public record. He was particularly interested in people who had experienced significant life changes and were demonstrating resilience in difficult circumstances." I stared at the file, feeling violated and manipulated despite the generous outcome of his investigation. He was stalking me? Not stalking, Miss Cavendish, researching. Mr. Montclair Wessington was very particular about how he chose to distribute his wealth, and he wanted to make an informed decision based on more than just a single interaction. The investigators were instructed to observe, but never to interfere or make contact. The distinction felt important, but insufficient to address my growing discomfort with learning that my private struggles had been the subject of professional surveillance. I flipped through the file, seeing documentation of my work schedule, my living situation, even photographs of me walking to my car after late shifts at the gas station. "But there's something else," Theodore continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone about to deliver potentially shocking news. something that Mr. Montclair Wessington discovered during the investigation that convinced him you were the right person to inherit his estate? I looked up from the surveillance photos, bracing myself for whatever revelation was coming next. The day had already brought enough surprises to last a lifetime, but something in Theodore's expression suggested that the biggest shock was still ahead. What did he discover? Theodore reached for another document, one that had been in a separate sealed envelope marked with instructions that it should only be opened after I had accepted the inheritance and been informed of the investigation. Mr. Montclair Wessington was not just a wealthy businessman, Miss Cavendish. He was also your grandfather. The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence, reshaping everything I thought I understood about my life, my family, and the extraordinary chain of events that had led me to this moment. I stared at Theodore Ashworth, certain I had misheard him, that grief and shock had somehow distorted his words into something impossible. "That's not possible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather died when I was 7 years old. I remember his funeral. I remember my father crying." Theodore's expression was gentle but firm as he opened the sealed envelope and removed what appeared to be a birth certificate, along with several other official documents. "Your paternal grandfather, Harrison Cavendish, did indeed pass away when you were young, but your maternal grandfather, your mother's father, was very much alive until 3 days ago." My mother's father. I tried to remember anything my mother had ever told me about her family, but came up with almost nothing. She had always been vague about her background, dismissive when I asked questions, claiming that her family had been unimportant people who hadn't stayed in touch after she married my father. The few times I had pressed for details, she had become uncomfortable and changed the subject so definitively that I had learned to stop asking. "My mother told me her father abandoned the family when she was young," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I realized how little I actually knew about my mother's early life. "She said he walked out and never came back." "That's not entirely accurate, Miss Cavendish. According to the documentation Mr. Montclair Wessington provided, there was a significant conflict between him and your mother when she was in her early 20s. She disapproved of his business practices and accused him of being involved in activities she considered unethical. They had a falling out that lasted over 40 years. Theodore handed me a photograph that had been included in the sealed envelope. It showed a much younger version of the man I had met at the gas station, standing next to a woman I recognized immediately, despite the decades that had passed. My mother, probably in her early 20s, smiling beside a man who shared her distinctive bone structure and the same pale blue eyes that had seemed so striking when I met him. She cut off all contact with him in 1981, shortly before she married your father. Mr. Montclair Wessington spent many years trying to reconcile with her, but she refused all attempts at communication. Eventually, he stopped trying direct contact, but never stopped caring about her welfare or yours. I studied the photograph, seeing resemblances I had never noticed before because I had never had reason to look for them. The shape of my mother's jaw was exactly like his, and looking at my own reflection in the office window, I could see traces of the same features in my own face. "He's been watching me for years, hasn't he?" I asked, beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening without my knowledge, not watching in the sense of surveillance, Miss Cavendish, at least not until recently. But, yes, he kept track of your family from a distance. He knew when you graduated from law school, when you married, when you began your environmental law practice. He was proud of your achievements, even though he couldn't share in them directly. The revelation was overwhelming, but it also explained so much about the strange encounter at the gas station. The way he had spoken to me with such familiarity, the questions about my background that had seemed overly personal for a stranger, the immediate trust he had shown in giving me such a substantial amount of cash. Why didn't he contact me sooner? Why wait until I was working at a gas station in the middle of the night? Theodore consulted another document from the file. According to his notes, he had been considering reaching out to you for several years, but he didn't want to disrupt your life while you seemed to be doing well. He knew about your marriage to Maximilian Thornfield, your successful law practice, the comfortable life you had built. He felt that introducing himself at that point might cause more harm than good, especially given the unresolved conflict with your mother. But something changed. Your divorce became public record. Miss Cavendish, Mr. Montclair Wessington learned about the proceedings and began following the case. What he discovered about how you were being treated, the false allegations, the systematic destruction of your reputation and financial security, convinced him that he needed to act. I thought about the months of legal proceedings, the humiliation of having my character assassinated in court, the friends who had believed the lies about me rather than trusting what they knew of my actual character. It had felt like being completely alone in the world, abandoned by everyone who was supposed to care about me. He hired investigators to confirm what he suspected about the divorce proceedings. Theodore continued. What they found infuriated him. The evidence against you was fabricated, purchased through a network of contacts that specialized in destroying people's reputations for the right price. Your ex-husband had access to that network through some of his business associates. The confirmation of what I had always known but could never prove was both vindicating and devastating. I had been right about being set up, but learning the extent of the conspiracy against me made the betrayal even more painful. Mr. Montclair Wessington's investigators were able to trace the falsified documents back to their sources, identify the people who had been paid to lie about you, even track the financial transactions that had funded the entire operation. He compiled all of this evidence with the intention of helping you appeal your divorce settlement. Why didn't he just approach me directly with the evidence? Why the elaborate encounter at the gas station? Theodore smiled slightly. The first time his professional demeanor had cracked during our entire conversation, because he wanted to meet his granddaughter as herself, not as someone who might feel obligated to him because of what he could do for her. He wanted to see what kind of person you had become without the influence of his wealth or his assistance. I understood then that the encounter at the gas station had been a test, but not the kind of manipulative evaluation I had initially feared. It had been a grandfather's attempt to know his granddaughter as she really was, stripped of all the social pretenses and financial pressures that might have colored their relationship if he had approached me as a wealthy benefactor. The $10,000 was just the beginning, Theodore explained. He planned to gradually reveal himself to you to help you rebuild your life and eventually to establish the kind of relationship with you that he had never been able to have with your mother. His death accelerated that timeline considerably. What was the conflict with my mother? Why did they stop speaking? This question seemed to make Theodore uncomfortable, and he consulted his notes before answering. The details are somewhat complex, Miss Cavendish, and involve business practices from a different era that might be difficult to understand in current context. Mr. Montclair Wessington built his fortune through real estate development and investment during the 1970s and 80s, when environmental regulations were much less stringent than they are today. I began to understand where this was heading. My mother would have been coming of age during the early environmental movement, the time when people were first becoming aware of the long-term costs of unchecked development and industrial growth. He was involved in projects that caused environmental damage, I said, not really asking. Several large-scale developments that were perfectly legal at the time but would not meet current environmental standards. Your mother, who was studying biology in college and had become passionate about conservation, discovered some of the details of his business practices and confronted him about them. She felt that he was prioritizing profit over environmental responsibility. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. My mother had cut ties with her father over environmental issues, and now he was leaving his fortune to me, specifically to continue environmental work. It was as if he had spent 4 decades trying to find a way to make amends for the conflict that had destroyed their relationship. He changed his business practices dramatically after their falling out, Theodore continued. By the mid-1980s, he had completely shifted his focus towards sustainable development and environmental restoration. Much of his wealth in recent years has come from investments in renewable energy and conservation projects. He was trying to make up for what he had done earlier. In part, yes, but I think it was more than that. I think losing his daughter made him realize that there were things more important than maximizing profit, and that perspective influenced everything he did afterward. I thought about my mother, trying to imagine her as a passionate young environmentalist confronting her father about his business practices. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the woman I knew, who had always seemed more concerned with social propriety and financial security than with any kind of political or environmental activism. Does my mother know he's dead? Not yet. Mr. Montclair Wessington left instructions that she should be informed after you had been told about the inheritance and had decided whether to accept it. He felt that the news of his death might be complicated by knowledge of what he had left to you. I could imagine my mother's reaction to learning that her estranged father had left his entire fortune to me rather than attempting reconciliation with her. It would feel like a final rejection, a judgment on the choices she had made 40 years earlier. There's something else you should know, Miss Cavendish. Your mother did try to contact him once, about 10 years ago. She was having some financial difficulties, and she reached out through intermediaries to see if he might be willing to help. What happened? He immediately arranged for assistance, but he did it anonymously through a series of financial instruments that made it impossible to trace back to him. He paid off her mortgage, established a fund to cover her living expenses, and ensured that she would never face financial hardship again. She never knew the help came from him. This revelation painted my grandfather in an even more complex light. He had been quietly caring for the daughter who had rejected him providing financial security without expecting recognition or reconciliation. It was the kind of generous, patient love that most people could only aspire to. Why didn't he tell her? Because he believed that if she knew the help came from him, she would refuse it out of pride. He loved her more than he needed her to love him back, Miss Cavendish. That's a rare quality in any relationship. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what I had learned. My entire understanding of my family history had been rewritten in the space of an afternoon. The grandfather I had never known existed had been quietly watching over all of us for decades, and now he was entrusting me with the resources to carry forward work that would honor both his legacy and my mother's early ideals. The environmental work he mentioned in his letter, I said finally, how extensive is it? Theodore opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be annual reports from various conservation organizations and environmental groups. Quite extensive. Mr. Montclair Wessington has been funding habitat restoration projects, renewable energy research, sustainable development initiatives, and legal advocacy work for environmental protection. The annual budget for these activities is approximately $3 million. $3 million a year for environmental work was more than most major conservation organizations had to spend on their entire operations. The scope of what I was being asked to oversee was staggering, but it was also exactly the kind of work I had dreamed of being able to do when I first went to law school. I don't know if I'm qualified to manage something that large, I admitted, though even as I said it, I realized that my grandfather had specifically chosen me because he believed I was qualified. Mr. Montclair Wessington anticipated that concern, Miss Cavendish. He's arranged for you to work with established environmental law firms and conservation organizations that have been implementing his vision for years. You won't be expected to build everything from scratch, but rather to guide and expand work that's already proving successful. As Theodore walked me through the details of the various environmental initiatives I would be inheriting, I began to understand that, my grandfather had essentially created the kind of legal and financial infrastructure that I had always wished existed for environmental work. Instead of having to convince clients to fund conservation projects or begging for grants to support environmental litigation, I would have the resources to pursue any case or project that aligned with the goals he had established. There are also educational components, Theodore explained, showing me documentation of scholarship programs and research grants that my grandfather had been funding, environmental law programs at several universities, research into sustainable development practices, even support for young lawyers who want to specialize in environmental advocacy but can't afford to work for the typical nonprofit salaries. It was as if my grandfather had looked at all the systemic problems that made environmental law difficult and expensive to practice and had systematically addressed each one through careful application of his resources. Miss Cavendish, there is one final matter we need to discuss, and it's somewhat urgent. Mr. Montclair Wessington's distant relatives, the ones I mentioned who might contest the will, have already begun making inquiries. We received a call this morning from an attorney representing his deceased brother's children, questioning the validity of leaving everything to someone who isn't a blood relative. But I am a blood relative. Indeed, but they don't know that yet. Mr. Montclair Wessington was very private about the estrangement from your mother, and his extended family has no idea you exist. From their perspective, he left his fortune to a complete stranger he met at a gas station. I could understand their confusion and even their anger. If I had been in their position, I would probably be asking the same questions about why a wealthy relative had bypassed his family to leave everything to someone none of them had ever heard of. What do they want? Initially, they wanted to see the will and understand the reasoning behind Mr. Montclair Wessington's decision. Now, they're threatening to challenge the entire estate on the grounds of mental incompetence or undue influence. They're arguing that no rational person would leave such a large fortune to a stranger and that you must have somehow manipulated him. The accusation of manipulation stung, especially coming so soon after my experience with Maximilian's lawyers, who had painted me as unstable and manipulative during our divorce proceedings. The idea that I might have to defend myself against similar charges again was exhausting to contemplate. Do they have legal standing to challenge the will? Not really, assuming we can demonstrate that you are indeed Mr. Montclair Wessington's granddaughter. But they do have the resources to tie up the estate in litigation for months or even years if they choose to pursue it aggressively. And if they succeed, if they could somehow prove mental incompetence or undue influence, the estate would be distributed according to the default inheritance laws, which would give them substantial portions of his wealth. However, Mr. Montclair Wessington anticipated this possibility and took extensive precautions. Theodore removed another folder, this one containing what appeared to be medical records and psychiatric evaluations. He had himself thoroughly examined by multiple physicians and mental health professionals during the weeks before his death, specifically to establish his mental competence and decision-making capacity. He also documented his reasoning for the inheritance decision extensively, including the investigation into your background and the family history that led to his choice. So the documentation exists to prove I'm his granddaughter? Yes, though revealing that information means disclosing details about the family estrangement that Mr. Montclair Wessington preferred to keep private. It also means potentially reopening old wounds with your mother, who will learn not only that her father is dead, but that he left his fortune to you rather than attempting reconciliation with her. The complexity of the family dynamics was becoming overwhelming. I was trying to process my own grief for a grandfather I had never known, while simultaneously preparing for a legal battle with relatives I had never met, and anticipating my mother's reaction to news that would probably devastate her. How long do I have to decide how to handle the challenge from his relatives? They've given us 72 hours to provide documentation supporting the inheritance decision, or they'll file formal proceedings to contest the will. That gives us until Monday morning. I looked at my watch and realized it was already late Friday afternoon. The weekend would give me time to process everything I had learned, but Monday would bring decisions that could affect not just my own future, but the future of all the environmental work my grandfather had been supporting. Miss Cavendish, there's one more element to this situation that I should mention. Mr. Montclair Wessington specifically anticipated that you might face challenges from his extended family, and he left instructions for how to handle such challenges. What kind of instructions? Theodore opened one final envelope, this one marked with very specific instructions about when it should be opened and read. He suggested that the most effective way to resolve questions about his decision would be to arrange a meeting between you and his relatives, where you could explain not only your family connection, but also your qualifications to carry forward his environmental work. A meeting with people who think I'm a con artist who manipulated their elderly relative. A meeting with people who loved him and are concerned that his life's work might be squandered by someone who doesn't understand or share his values. Mr. Montclair Wessington believed that once they met you and heard your story, they would understand his decision and might even become allies in continuing his legacy. The idea of facing a room full of hostile relatives was intimidating, but I was beginning to understand that my grandfather had been a strategic thinker who had anticipated most of the complications that might arise from his unconventional inheritance decision. Did he leave suggestions for what I should tell them? He left suggestions for what you should show them, Miss Cavendish. Evidence of your legal background, your environmental work, your character as demonstrated during your recent difficulties, and most importantly, proof that you are his granddaughter, and thus exactly the kind of person he hoped might carry forward his values. I spent the weekend in my small apartment, surrounded by documents and photographs that had transformed my understanding of my own history. The legal papers establishing my inheritance sat on my kitchen table next to the $10,000 in cash that had started this entire journey, but now both seemed like symbols of something much larger than financial security. Sunday evening, I finally called my mother. The conversation was one of the most difficult I had ever initiated, but I knew she needed to hear about her father's death from me rather than from lawyers or distant relatives who might not handle the news with appropriate sensitivity. Serafina, this is unexpected. Is everything all right? Her voice carried the carefully controlled concern that had characterized most of our interactions since my divorce. She had never quite known how to handle my fall from the social status that marriage to Maximilian had provided, and our conversations had become stilted and awkward. Mom, I need to tell you something important. I think you should sit down. I explained about meeting Percival at the gas station, about the inheritance, and finally about learning that he was her father. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. "That's impossible," she finally whispered. "My father has been dead to me for 40 years. I don't care if he just died. He was already dead as far as I was concerned." "Mom, he never stopped loving you. He's been helping you financially for years without you knowing it. He paid off your mortgage, set up funds to cover your expenses." "I don't want to hear this, Serafina. I don't want to know anything about what he did or didn't do. He made his choices a long time ago, and I made mine." Her reaction was exactly what I had feared, but I pressed forward anyway. "He changed, Mom. After you cut contact with him, he completely changed his business practices. He spent decades trying to make up for the environmental damage he had caused earlier. It doesn't matter what he did later. What matters is what he was doing when I needed him to be better. What matters is that he chose money over principles, profit over responsibility." I could hear the pain in her voice, the 40-year-old wound that had never healed. But I could also hear something else, the idealistic young woman who had cared enough about environmental issues to confront her own father about his business practices. "He left me everything so I could continue environmental work, Mom. He wanted someone who understood both law and conservation to carry forward projects he's been funding for years. It's like he was trying to honor the principles you believed in when you were young. Don't try to make this about honoring my principles, Serafina. This is about him trying to buy forgiveness from beyond the grave and using you to do it. The conversation ended badly, with my mother hanging up before we could resolve anything. But it also convinced me that my grandfather had been right about the complexity of family relationships and the importance of demonstrating character through actions rather than words. Monday morning brought the meeting with Percival's extended family. Theodore had arranged for us to meet at his law firm's conference room, a neutral space where everyone could review documents and ask questions without the emotional weight of meeting in my grandfather's home or office. The relatives who arrived were exactly what I had expected: well-dressed, clearly wealthy, and obviously skeptical about my claims. There were 4 of them, ranging in age from their 40s to their 70s, representing different branches of the family tree that had diverged from my grandfather's line decades earlier. Theodore began the meeting by reading portions of my grandfather's letter explaining his decision, then presented the family history documentation that established my identity as his granddaughter. The reaction was immediate and intense. "This is the first we've heard of any daughter," said the oldest of the group, a woman named Patricia Montclair Hedgeworth, who appeared to have appointed herself the family spokesperson. Percival never mentioned having a child who had been estranged from him. Mr. Montclair Wessington was a very private man, Theodore replied diplomatically. The family estrangement was a source of considerable pain for him, and he didn't discuss it with people outside the immediate situation. But surely he would have mentioned having a granddaughter, insisted another relative, a man who introduced himself as Percival's great-nephew. We had dinner with him just last Christmas. If he had been planning to leave everything to a family member, that would have been the time to mention it. I realized that these people had genuinely cared about my grandfather and had expected to inherit, not because they were greedy, but because they believed they were his only family. Learning that he had a granddaughter he had never mentioned must have felt like a betrayal of the relationship they thought they had with him. "I understand this is difficult news," I said, speaking for the first time since introductions had been made. "I only learned about him myself a few days ago. My mother cut contact with him before I was born, and I grew up not knowing he existed." This admission seemed to surprise them, and Patricia's expression softened slightly. "You didn't know about him? Then how did you meet him?" I explained about my divorce, my job at the gas station, and the chance encounter that had led to everything else. As I spoke, I could see their skepticism gradually giving way to curiosity and eventually to something that might have been understanding. "So you're saying he sought you out specifically because you were his granddaughter, but you had no idea who he was when you met him?" asked the great-nephew. "That's exactly what I'm saying. I thought he was just a kind stranger who had given me money for reasons I couldn't understand. I had no idea about any family connection until Mr. Ashworth called me with news of the inheritance." Theodore then presented the documentation of my background, including my environmental law education and the work I had done before my marriage. He also shared some of the evidence that my grandfather's investigators had compiled about the fabricated charges in my divorce case. Your grandfather was particularly impressed by Miss Cavendish's commitment to environmental law and her resilience in dealing with very difficult personal circumstances, Theodore explained. He felt that she represented exactly the kind of person who could carry forward his environmental work with both competence and integrity. Patricia studied my law school transcripts and the summary of cases I had worked on, her expression growing more thoughtful. You specialized in habitat protection and sustainable development regulation. Yes, ma'am. It was the kind of work I was most passionate about, though it was difficult to make a living at it without substantial resources to support long-term litigation, which is exactly what Percival's Environmental Trust provides, she observed. Substantial resources for long-term environmental litigation and conservation projects. I nodded, beginning to understand that she was seeing the logic of my grandfather's decision, even if she was disappointed by it. Miss Cavendish, said another relative, a man who had been quietly studying the family photographs Theodore had provided. What are your plans for the inheritance? Do you intend to continue the environmental work, or do you plan to liquidate everything and retire on the proceeds? It was clearly a test question designed to determine whether my interest was in the money or in the mission my grandfather had established. I intend to honor my grandfather's wishes and expand the environmental work he was supporting, I replied without hesitation. The inheritance is more than I could ever spend on personal needs, and I believe it represents an opportunity to make a real difference in conservation and environmental protection. Patricia and the great-nephew exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Percival always said that wealth was a tool, not a goal, Patricia said slowly. He believed that people who accumulated resources had a responsibility to use them for purposes that outlasted their own lives. I understand that philosophy, I replied, and I understand that I'm inheriting not just money, but a responsibility to use it in ways that would make him proud. The meeting continued for another hour, with the relatives asking detailed questions about my background, my plans, and my understanding of the various environmental projects my grandfather had been supporting. By the end, their hostility had been replaced by cautious acceptance and even tentative approval. Miss Cavendish, Patricia said as the meeting was concluding, I want you to know that while we're disappointed not to inherit Uncle Percival's estate, we understand his reasoning. You are clearly qualified to carry forward his work, and you are family, even if we didn't know you existed. Does this mean you won't be challenging the will? It means we'll be watching to make sure you honor his legacy, she replied with a slight smile. But no, we won't be challenging the inheritance. Percival was always an excellent judge of character, and if he chose you, then you must be worthy of that trust. 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of the Montclair Wessington Environmental Foundation, reviewing grant applications from conservation organizations around the world. The foundation was housed in a converted brownstone in downtown Portland, with modern offices for the legal staff and researchers who helped evaluate potential projects. My life had changed in ways I could never have imagined when I was working the night shift at the gas station, but the work felt like a natural extension of everything I had always wanted to do as an environmental lawyer. Instead of struggling to find clients who could afford to pay for environmental litigation, I was able to fund the most important cases and projects without regard to their immediate profitability. The relationship with my grandfather's extended family had evolved into something approaching friendship. Patricia had become a valuable advisor on some of the more complex investment decisions, and several of the other relatives had joined the foundation's board of directors, bringing their own expertise in business and philanthropy to support the environmental mission. My mother had eventually come around to accepting the inheritance, though she still refused to discuss her father's memory with anything approaching warmth. She had, however, begun volunteering with one of the conservation organizations the foundation supported, channeling some of her old passion for environmental issues into practical work that honored the ideals she had once believed in strongly enough to sacrifice her relationship with her father. The legal battle to clear my name from the fabricated charges in my divorce had been swift and decisive once my grandfather's investigators shared their evidence with the appropriate authorities. Maximilian and several of his associates were facing criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy, and I had been awarded a substantial settlement that I had donated entirely to environmental causes. Most importantly, I had found the sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for years. Every day brought new opportunities to use legal tools and financial resources to protect natural habitats, promote sustainable development, and hold corporations accountable for environmental damage. It was exactly the kind of work I had dreamed of doing when I first went to law school, but with resources and support I had never imagined possible. As I reviewed the latest batch of grant applications, I came across one that made me pause. It was a proposal from a young environmental lawyer who wanted to establish a legal clinic, providing free representation to communities fighting pollution and habitat destruction. The lawyer's background was remarkably similar to my own, working for years at low-paying jobs while trying to build a practice focused on environmental justice. I approved the grant immediately, then made a note to call the applicant personally. My grandfather had understood that the most effective philanthropy wasn't just about giving money, but about identifying people whose character and commitment made them worthy of trust and resources. He had seen something in me during our brief encounter that convinced him I would use his gift wisely, and now it was my turn to recognize that same potential in others. That evening, I drove past the gas station where everything had begun. It was under new management now, with different staff and a recently renovated interior, but I still felt a sense of gratitude for the place that had brought my grandfather and me together. The night shift that had seemed like the lowest point of my life had actually been the beginning of everything I had been meant to do. My phone rang as I was driving home, and I smiled when I saw Theodore Ashworth's name on the caller ID. He had become not just my attorney, but a trusted friend and advisor, someone who had known my grandfather well enough to help me understand his values and priorities. Serafina, I just received some interesting news from the investigative firm your grandfather used. They've been continuing their work on your divorce case, and they've uncovered some additional evidence that might interest you. More evidence against Maximilian. Evidence that suggests the network he used to fabricate evidence against you has been operating for much longer than we originally thought, targeting other people in similar circumstances. The authorities are now investigating whether this might be part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple divorce cases. The possibility that other people had suffered the same kind of systematic destruction that I had experienced was both horrifying and motivating. If the resources my grandfather had left me could be used to expose and stop such networks, then perhaps some good could come from the pain that had brought us together. What can we do to help the investigation? The foundation could fund a legal defense fund for other victims and possibly support investigative journalism to expose how these networks operate. Your grandfather would have appreciated the irony of using his inheritance to fight the kind of corruption and manipulation that nearly destroyed his granddaughter. As I hung up the phone and pulled into the driveway of my new home, a modest but comfortable house that reflected my values rather than my net worth, I thought about the chain of events that had brought me to this moment. A cruel divorce had led to financial desperation, which had led to a job at a gas station, which had led to meeting a grandfather I had never known existed, which had led to inheriting the resources to do work that honored both his legacy and my own deepest values. My grandfather had been right about character revealing itself in how people treated others when they thought no one important was watching. But he had also understood something else, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead us exactly where we need to be if we have the courage to see opportunity in adversity and the wisdom to use unexpected gifts in service of something larger than ourselves. The $10,000 he had given me that first night still sat in a frame on my desk, not because of its monetary value, but because it represented the moment when a stranger's kindness had changed the trajectory of my entire life. Now it was my turn to be that stranger for someone else, to recognize potential where others saw only struggle, and to provide resources that could transform lives in ways that honored the best impulses of human nature. Standing in my driveway, looking up at the stars that were just becoming visible in the darkening sky, I felt the presence of the grandfather I had never known, but who had shaped my future more profoundly than anyone else in my life. He had given me not just financial security, but the opportunity to become the person I had always been meant to be, and I intended to spend every day of my remaining life proving worthy of that extraordinary gift.